Hi everyone, welcome to the CFPR lunchtime seminar for this week. We're very happy to have, I'm Jessica and I'll be chairing this session. We're very happy to have Ken Yamada, who is a professor of economics at Kyoto University, who will be telling us more about the race between technological progress and female advancement. Professor Yamada received his PhD in economics from the University College London. He actually started his career at SMU, where he was there as an assistant professor of economics for several years. So he's actually quite familiar with the Singapore landscape. After his stint at SMU, he moved back to Kyoto and has been a professor there since then. He works on a lot of very interesting issues that I believe will be of great interest to the CFPR community, including issues related to intra-household allocation of resources, living arrangements, inequality trends in wage, income and consumption, minimum wages, as well as technological change. A lot of his work uses data from Japan as well as globally. And so I think we're very excited to have him here to share some of his work with us. I believe this seminar runs for about an hour, and Ken has very happily agreed to take questions throughout the seminar. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the raise hand function or write your questions in the chat box, and I'll call on you to basically unmute yourself and ask the question at an opportune time. You're also welcome to hold your questions to the end, but we'll leave about 10 or 15 minutes for some Q&A. So I think without much further ado, I'll invite Ken to begin his presentation. Ken.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jessica, for very nice introduction. I'm happy to have opportunity to give talk in this seminar. Thank you for this opportunity. This is a joint work with PhD student Hiro Taniguchi at Kyoto University. The older version of this paper is available online, and we plan to update the paper sometime this month, and you will see the new version from the same URL. Here's the outline of today's talk, which is divided into 4 parts. I would like to start this presentation by introducing some basic facts on changes in gender and skill premia in 11 major OECD countries during the period between 1980 and 2005. This facts is documented using the data from EU CLEMS, which provides detailed and internationally comparable information about prices and quantities of capital and labor inputs in many OECD countries. After showing the basic facts on changes in gender and wage premia during this period, I would like to present a simple economic framework which is useful for interpreting changes in gender wage premia over the past few decades. And this idea is referred to as the race between supply and demand. So our framework builds upon the standard economic principles of supply and demand, which is intuitive widely. And using this framework, we consider how to interpret changes in the skill wage gap and the gender wage gap. The skill is defined by education level, and this is a very standard classification in the literature. Skilled labor is basically defined as college graduate workers, while unskilled labor is classified as non-college graduate workers. So the skilled wage gap is measured by the relative wages of skilled labor to unskilled labor. So this is basically the wage gap between college graduate workers and non-college graduate workers. And the gender wage gap is simply defined by the ratio of the average male wage to the average female wage. Oftentimes, this framework is used to understand changes in the skilled wage premium. And our question is whether the same economic forces can be useful to interpret the changes in the gender wage premium. And the key element of our model is capital skill complementarity. So after introducing the basic framework of supply and demand, I would like to introduce the idea of capital skill complementarity and its implications. And I'd like to end my presentation by showing the key results of this paper. The first two figures shows the trends in the male-female wage gap for the United States and OECD average. The left panel shows the United States and the right panel shows the OECD countries. And each figure has two lines. The dashed line shows trends in skilled gender wage gap. This is a male-female wage gap for skilled labor, so college graduate workers. And dotted line shows the trends in unskilled gender wage gap, which is the male-female wage gap among non-college workers. And the two has very different trends. The skilled gender gap remains stable over this period, but unskilled gender gap has sharp decline from 1980 to 2005. And the vertical axis shows the log point change in the gender gap. So minus 0.2 means about 20% decline in the gender wage gap. The majority of the workers in the labor market are actually unskilled. They do not graduate from university. So when we take the weighted average of the two, the gender wage gap shows the declining trends. But if we show the trends in the gender wage gap separately for skilled labor and unskilled labor, then we can find the sharp difference in the gender wage gap by skill. And the same applies to the OECD average. Although there's a slight change in the trends between the mid-1980, after mid-1980, there's sharp decline in the gender wage gap for unskilled labor. On the other hand, there's not much change in the gender wage gap for skilled labor. So one of the purposes of our paper is to explain the difference in the gender wage gap between skilled and unskilled labor. And the next two figures shows trends in the skilled-unskilled wage gap for the United States and OECD average. And in the United States, both male skill wage gap and the female wage skill gap have increasing trends. The dashed line shows male skill wage gap and dotted line shows the female skill wage gap. And the rate of increase in the skill wage gap is much greater for male workers than female workers. So there's again a difference in the wage gap by observed characteristics. And a similar thing applies to the OECD average. While there's not much change in the female skilled wage gap, there has been an increase in trends for the male skilled wage gap after the mid-1980s. Even in the early 1980s, there's a smaller decline in the male wage gap than in the female wage gap. Economists often use the supply and demand framework to understand changes in the relative wages of labor. And this is sometimes referred to as the race between supply and demand in this context. The idea dates back to the work by Timbergen, and this is popularized by a series of work by Golding and Katz. The idea builds upon the supply and demand principle of economics. So I think this is intuitive. So the basic idea is that if the supply of skill increases, then the price of skill will decline. On the other hand, if the demand for skill increases, then the price of skill will increase. I think it's easy to understand this idea diagrammatically. So let me use this figure. So this is a standard figure that characterizes the labor market equilibrium. The vertical axis is the relative wages of high-skilled labor to unskilled labor. And the horizontal axis is the relative labor quantity of high-skilled labor to unskilled labor. And we have upward sloping supply curve and downward sloping demand curve. Supply curve is upward sloping because as wage increases, more workers are willing to work. On the other hand, demand curve is downward sloping because more firms are willing to hire workers as wage declines. And in the equilibrium, supply meets the demand. So the equilibrium relative wages in this labor market is WH over WU asterisk. And in reality, supply curve shifts over time. And when we think of the labor market for the skilled and unskilled, the relative supply curve shift outward because of rise in educational attainment. Because of the progress in higher education, the supply curve shift outward. In this case, the equilibrium wage gap actually declines from this asterisk to double asterisk. So the supply shift alone cannot explain a rising the skilled wage premium. To explain a rising the skilled wage premium, we need a demand shift. If the demand curve shift outward, then the equilibrium wage gap increase from asterisk to double asterisk. In reality, both demand curve and supply curve shift outward. In this case, whether the equilibrium wage gap increase or decrease depend on the relative magnitude of an effect of supply shift and demand shift. In this particular case, because shift in demand exceeds shift in supply, the equilibrium wage gap increases from asterisk to double asterisk. But if the supply curve shift further to the right, then it may be the case that the equilibrium wage gap may not change or even decline. So according to the relative magnitude of a shift in demand and supply, we may be able to explain a difference in the skilled wage gap between male and female workers. And in this paper, we would like to address the question as to whether we can explain changes in the gender gap in terms of the idea of the race between supply and demand. We know that this idea is useful for explaining changes in the skilled wage premium, but the question remains whether this can apply to changes in the gender wage gap. In principle, it's possible. Here, I just replace the wage of skilled labor with the wage of female labor. And also we replace the unskilled labor's wage with male labor's wage. And then we have upper sloping curve, supply curve, and downward sloping demand curve. And again, the equilibrium is determined where supply meets demand. If the demand curve shift outward and the supply curve shift outward, then the equilibrium wage gap can change in the new equilibrium. And it's most likely that the supply curve shift to the right because of advances in female employment. And if the demand curve also shift outward and the size of the shift is large enough, then the relative wage of female labor to male labor would increase in the new equilibrium. So potentially we can use this demand and supply framework to explain the changes in gender wage gap. But this is an empirical paper. We actually estimate the model and try to see whether this principle can apply to changes in the gender wage gap as well as the skill wage gap. And we are also interested in differences in the gender wage gap by skill and the skill wage gap by gender, as I showed in the first four figures. The idea of the race between supply and demand can be expressed using these simple equations. The idea is basically that the change in skill and gender premium can be decomposed into two parts. One is supply shifts, which may be due to advances in technology, and supply shifts, which arises from a rising educational attainment and female employment. And it's easy to imagine the cause of supply shift because we know that in many countries, educational attainment has increased and also the female employment rate has increased. But it's relatively hard to imagine what causes a demand shift. And there are several candidates for the demand shifts. But in this paper, we hypothesize that ICT, information and communication technology, is an important factor in raising the demand for skilled labor or female labor. And this hypothesis builds upon the recent literature that shows the effects of ICT or computerization on labor market outcomes. It's been shown in the literature in economics that the increased use of ICT is associated with increase in the relative demand for skilled labor and female labor. For example, these studies shows that the female shares of employment hours and wages are higher in computer-intensive occupation or computer-intensive industries. There's also evidence that increased use of ICT is associated with changes in occupational skill requirement, such as a rising non-routine analytical and interactive skills, which is known to be a factor in widening skill wage gap, and a declining routine cognitive and manual tasks, which is factor in narrowing the gender wage gap, and also increased importance of interpersonal skill, which also contribute to narrowing the gender wage gap. So all these studies basically suggest that when the ICT capital equipment is introduced or expanded, the relative demand for labor changes. The relative demand for skilled or female increase after rising the ICT equipment. So motivated by these findings, we consider aggregate production function in which 4 types of labor, male skilled, female skilled, male unskilled, and female unskilled, differ in the degree of substitution with ICT equipment. And if the degree of substitution with equipment is different among different types of labor, then the relative demand for labor can change after the expansion of ICT. In particular, if ICT equipment is more complementary or equivalently less substitutable with skilled than unskilled labor, then the introduction or expansion of ICT will raise the relative demand for skilled to unskilled labor. And this is the idea of capital skill complementarity. And similarly, if ICT capital is more complementary to female labor than male labor, then it will raise the demand for female labor to male labor. So ICT equipment may also contribute to reducing the gender wage gap, as well as increasing the skill wage gap. And the gain from specifying the production function is that we can derive the following equation naturally from the profit maximization conditions. The equation says that changes in skill and gender premium can be decomposed into demand shift, which is in this case represented by the capital skill complementarity effects, and supply shifts represented by the relative labor quantity effects. The capital skill complementarity effects arises from a rising ICT equipment that we observe in the past few decades in many OECD countries. And the relative labor quantity effects arises from changes in the ratio of different types of labor. This arises, for example, due to advances in educational attainment or advances in female employment. This changes the relative supply of labor in the labor market, and that will contribute to changes in the gender and skilled wage premium. And this is empirical paper, so we do not assume that the degree of substitution with ICT equipment is different across different types of labor. Instead, we allow for this possibility and then actually estimate the degree of substitution with ICT equipment with different types of labor using cross-country panel data in OECD countries. And the hypothesis we test in this paper is that the capital skill gender hypothesis, which means that the elasticity of substitution for ICT is smaller in this order. So this inequality means that female labor may be more complementary to ICT equipment than male labor. And skilled labor may be more complementary to unskilled labor. And if this inequality holds, then the introduction of ICT can change the relative demand for skilled labor and female labor in a way that we can explain changes in the gender and skill premium. We estimate a model to test the relative magnitudes of the degree of substitution among capital and labor inputs. Let me briefly sketch a way to estimate the degree of substitution. In the model in the paper, we actually have several different capital and labor inputs. So the estimating equation is slightly more involved, but the idea is simple. Let me focus on the production function with two inputs to get a key idea of how we can estimate the degree of substitution among different inputs. Essentially, the degree of substitution between different inputs can be estimated by looking at how relative input prices change in response to changes in relative input quantities. And elasticity of substitution is basically the percentage change in relative input quantities in response to percentage change in relative input prices. So the inverse of this coefficient beta is the elasticity of substitution. But to derive this equation from economic model, we actually need to make a number of assumptions, and some of the assumptions may not hold in the reality. So we need to allow for the possibility that the equation may be misspecified. In particular, the main concern is that this idiosyncratic error may be correlated with the key regressors. And to allow for this possibility, we examine a number of specifications. And one of the main idea of how we identify this beta is that we use instrumental variable, which is orthogonal to idiosyncratic shock to each countries. More specifically, we use the so-called shift share instrument. This is basically the interaction term between global shock to industries and the past local exposure to shock. The global shock is measured by the input growth in each industries at the global level. And the past local exposure to shock is measured by the industry share of each input in each country in the first year observation, so in 1980. And this is a global shock to industries, so which is likely to be orthogonal to idiosyncratic shock to each countries. So we can deal with this endogeneity problem with these instruments and appropriate controls. Finally, I would like to present the two sets of main results. The first set of results is the estimates of production function parameters And the second set of results is the results of decomposition of changes in gender and skill premium. In the model, we have actually 8 parameters, 4 substitution parameters and 4 share parameters. But let me focus on more relevant parameters, that is substitution parameters. The 4 parameters shows the degree of substitution with ICT capital equipment. This is the degree of substitution with female high-skilled labor and male skilled labor and female unskilled labor and male unskilled labor. So we have 4 parameters that governs the degree of substitution with ICT equipment. And the results look similar regardless of whether we use 5-year difference or 10-year difference in the estimations. And all parameters are very precisely estimated. And as you can see, the magnitudes of parameters are very different across different types of labor. And the degree of substitution with ICT equipment is smaller in the order of female skilled, male skilled, female unskilled, and male unskilled, as we expected from the hypothesis. These differences are actually statistically different. So these results support strongly the capital skill complementarity hypothesis. And in terms of elasticity, the capital labor substitution ranges from 0.7 to 9, and the labor substitution ranges from 1.2 to 4.3. So these results are broadly consistent with the literature, which estimates the degree of substitution between capital and labor. Although, as far as we are aware, none of the study estimates the degree of substitution between ICT equipment and different types of labor. This statistics shows that the instrument variables are very strongly correlated with the endogenous regressors. And the last 2 rows shows that over-identification restrictions are not rejected. So because we have more moment condition than the number of parameters, we can test the validity of the equations by testing the restrictions of our over-identifications. This result suggests that our specification is valid. Finally, based on the estimates of parameters in the production function, we decompose the 4 kinds of wage gap into capital skill complementarity effects, which captures the demand shift, and the relative labor quantity effects, which captures supply shifts. For a gender wage gap, the capital skill complementarity effect is negative, while the relative labor quantity effect is positive. So the 2 effects work in the opposite directions. And whether there is a change in the skill wage gap depends on the relative magnitudes of the 2 effects. For the skilled gender wage gap, the capital skill complementarity effect is very large because female labor is most complementary with ICT equipment. And this effect is negative because female labor is more complementary to ICT capital than male labor. And the relative labor quantity effect is also very large for the skilled gender wage gap because during this period, skilled female labor increased a lot more than the skilled male labor. For the unskilled gender wage gap, the 2 effects are small, but the capital skill complementarity effects exceeds the relative labor quantity effects. So as a result, there is a reduction in unskilled gender wage gap. The skilled gender wage gap does not change significantly because the large capital skill complementarity effect is cancelled out by the large relative labor quantity effects. But in the case of the unskilled wage gap, although the two effects are small, because the capital skill complementary effect exceeds the relative labor quantity effects, there is a significant decline in the unskilled wage gap. The reason for the small relative labor quantity effect is that there's not much difference in the changes in the unskilled male and female labor. For the male skill wage gap and female wage skill gap, the capital skill complementarity effect is positive because male labor is more complementary to ICT equipment than female labor. And the relative labor quantity effect is negative because due to advances in female employment, female labor increased more than male labor. Because of the advances in education attainment, skilled labor increased more than unskilled labor. So the relative labor quantity effects for the skill wage gap is negative. And two effects are nearly cancelled out. But if anything, the capital skill complementarity effect exceeds the relative labor quantity effects in the case for male skill wage gap. For the female skill wage gap, the capital skill complementarity is large, but this is smaller than the relative labor quantity effects. And the relative labor quantity effect is very large because female labor increased, female high skill labor increased a lot more than the female unskilled labor. So as a result, the female skill wage gap did not increase, or it actually, the model prediction is actually negative. The predicted value is not very close to the actual value, but if you look at the difference between the two for the predicted value and actual value, this is very similar. So in this sense, the model fits the data very well. The changes in skill wage gap, as well as the changes in the gender wage gap, are consistent with the prediction of the model. To summarize, we find that the degree of substitution with ICT capital equipment is very different among 4 types of labor. Skilled labor is more complementary to ICT capital than unskilled labor. In addition, female labor is more complementary to capital equipment than male labor. So we confirm the capital skill gender hypothesis in that sense. And these results are robust to various specifications. Although we cannot go through all the results, but the results remain the same if we estimate the model by industries. The concern is that there might be influence of international trades or structural change from goods sector to service sector. But our results remain the same even after taking into account these factors. And it also robust to controlling for changes in labor market institutions and country-specific nonlinear trends. So the precision of the estimation can vary across specification, but the relative magnitudes of substitution parameter remain the same. And finally, we have shown that the changes in the gender and the skill wage premium can be decomposed in the way that is consistent with the outcome of the race between supply and demand shifts. And the supply shift in this case is represented by the relative labor quantity effects, and the demand shift is represented by the capital skill complementarity effects. And as we have seen in the table, the two effects work in the opposite directions, and the relative magnitudes of the two effects determines the changes in gender and the skilled wage premium. So I think it takes roughly 30 minutes. So I would like to end my presentation, and I would be happy to have a question. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Ken. That was a very nice and succinct talk. At this point, I think, we'd like to invite people, any of the participants who have any questions to feel free to maybe raise their hands and unmute themselves, and feel free to ask questions. Anyone? Oh, Vincent?
Hi. Thanks, Prof. Yamada, for your presentation. I was sort of intrigued with the first slide, where you showed the difference between the US and the other countries, and we can sort of see that. Would you say the patterns are the same for US and OECD? And
Yeah,
if not, I was just wondering what the differences are between OECD and US.
The point I wanted to make in this slide is that the rate of decline in the gender wage gap differ by skill level. In the United States, there is a sharp decline in the rate of in the gender wage gap for unskilled workers, but not for skilled workers. And the rate of decline of gender wage gap is greater for unskilled workers than skilled workers. Yes. In this sense, the same applies to the OECD average.
I see.
Although the magnitude of the change differ between the United States and the OECD countries, still we can find a sharp decline in the gender gap for unskilled workers. But the skilled gender wage gap does not have clear trends. Well, there is some fluctuation, but it does not show the sharp decline.
I see. I suppose the what I find interesting is that there isn't much variation between countries. So this sort of gender and skill wage gap seems quite global. And is it a general phenomenon that that you can attribute to as you say, right, modern trends of ICT, substitution, and so on, that regardless of the level of development of countries and so on, that sort of, for the most part, all countries are subject to the same forces?
I think that is a very interesting point. So thank you for your questions. This is a global phenomenon. Well, in terms of decline in the gender wage gap, this is a global phenomenon. In many countries, the gender wage gap has been declining. But there's differences in trends in the skilled wage gap across countries. And we actually have another companion paper that focuses on international differences in the skilled wage gap. I can actually show you how the gender wage gap differ across countries. I haven't included in the paper yet, but the current draft.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Has so this is I think it's this is better to. It's easier to see the unskilled gender wage gap. So in many countries, we focus on the developed countries, OECD countries. So I don't know if the same thing applies to developing countries, but at least among OECD countries, the declining gender wage gap is a global phenomenon. And especially among unskilled workers, most of the country we see decline in the gender share. And because we take this so the width, this vertical axis is measured differently, so the decline is less clear. But in all the country, in most of the country, we see the decline. And there's a slight difference in the gender wage gap across countries for skilled labor. Although in many countries, it doesn't have clear trends, but there are some variations across countries.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, by the way, the bold line shows the actual data, and the dashed line shows the model prediction.
Yeah. Actually, in a sense, because you add the country fixed effects, the country, the things that don't change within the countries are sort of controlled for.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jessica.
No, not at all. So just a quick follow-up question, Ken. So I found the last picture very informative, because I think a question that was lingering at the back of my mind is to what, how much of the changes in ICT basically can explain the overall change in the gender wage gap, right? And I think there the estimates are quite mixed, but from the picture you just showed us earlier, it seems like at least for the unskilled wage gap, in many countries, the model seems to explain very, very well the overall decline. Does that surprise you that in some sense it almost seems like the model is doing extremely well? I mean, we know that gender wage gaps have declined substantially over the last 30 years for reasons that I guess a hypothesis is how much of it is actually due to the ICT revolution. And would you say that your finding is that, like, I guess what's the sort of headline number? Like, is it 80%, 90%? I think that might be useful to know. From the pictures, it seemed like it's very close to like 90 or 100% for the US, and I'm wondering if that's something that it's you expected or something that surprises you or not.
Yeah, this was a surprise to me. Well, we could expect that the relative labor quantity effect is large, because we know that in many countries, female employment rate increased substantially, and also the college enrollment rate increased substantially. So we can kind of guess the size of the relative labor quantity effects, but the demand shift cannot be observed directly from the data, and we can measure this quantity only after estimating the production functions, and we didn't expect that ICT has such a large effect.
So maybe it might be useful to show the relative breakdown of the quantity effect versus the demand side, because I think what you're showing is the net effect of the two. In a way, I'm expecting the demand side effect to be potentially smaller, which also raises another question, which is how much of the quantity effect is in response, right, to the demand side effects, which I know is beyond the scope of the paper, because clearly this is just like a decomposition on the basis of the model. But I'd be curious to kind of know relative magnitudes just to put things into perspective.
Yeah, thanks. We actually saw the same thing. The difficulty in showing the relative percentage is that the two effects work in the opposite directions. So each explain more than 100%.
Right. Yeah, because there's the offset decline. No, that's absolutely right. Yeah.
And we actually have more detailed decomposition results, which may answer part of your question. So can you see? Oh yeah. So we actually decompose changes in each measure of wage gap into specific capital and labor inputs. And as you can see from this figure, ICT capital has a very strong impact on changes in each measure of wage gap. And of course, labor quantity also an important factor in changing the wage gap, but ICT seems to have a very strong impact on this.
Interesting. Great. Thank you. Yeah, so I think there's another question in the chat box. Hongwei, do you want to unmute yourself to ask a question, or I can ask it on your behalf? I think essentially the question is more to do with clarifying elaborating on the data and the key measures. So I think his question is, could you elaborate on the data and key measures such as the shift share instrument that was used in the estimation?
Oh, okay. So that which yeah, so in the paper we have shown the trends in the relative labor quantities and the rental price of capital. So this this is a picture that summarizes the data. So there's a very large decline in the male relative labor quantity of male to female in United States and OECD countries. And the relative labor quantity of skilled to unskilled increased substantially, both in the United States and OECD countries. And the rental, interestingly, the rental price of capital declined sharply in ICT equipment. So this kind of indicates there has been important technological progress. In line with these trends, the ICT capital has been increasing substantially in the United States and other OECD countries. And other ICT capital did not increase as much as ICT capital. So when the degree of substitution for ICT capital is different across different types of labor, the introduction of ICT and the expansion of ICT equipment have strong effects and strong enough. And the effect is strong enough to explain changes in the gender and wage gap. We use this data from EU claims, and we use the 11 countries of the data. 11 countries includes Australia, Czech Republic, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Italy, Japan, Netherlands, and United States. And each country is composed of 30 industries, and we use global shock to these industries as a source of identifications for measuring the degree of substitutions. I'm not sure if I answer all the questions, but if you still have any questions on the data, let me know.
Okay, thank you.
I try to answer to the extent that I can answer.
Great. I think Hongwei says that yeah, he would like to say hi, but his kids are sleeping, so he'll remain silent. There's a question from T asking about the policy implications of the findings. If you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. So one of the findings in this paper is that we can explain changes in skill wage gap and gender wage gap in terms of observed factors. If it explained only by unobserved factors, then it's hard to draw some specific policy implications. But in our case, we can find that changes are explained in terms of observed factors. So we have a clear policy implications in that sense. So if we want to reduce the skill wage gap, probably the government would like to raise the quantity of skilled labor, and that would increase the relative labor quantity effects. And at the same time, it will reduce the capital skill complementarity effects, because this is proportional to the ratio of ICT equipment to skilled labor. So by increasing the skilled labor, if you, for example, if you expand the number of universities or capacity, then the skilled labor will increase in the future. Then in the future, the capital skill complementarity effects will decline, while the relative labor quantity effects will become even greater. So the skill wage gap will decline. There's implication for the gender wage gap as well. so as the female employment increases over time, then so in this case, let me see. In this case, the supply shifts. Yeah, so the supply shifts. Yeah, in this case. So sorry, I sometimes get confused because I'm thinking the two different measures of wage gap simultaneously. But when the relative demand for when the relative demand for female labor increases, then the skilled wage gap will increase. At the same time, that when the relative supply of female labor increases, then the relative wage of female labor will decline. Okay, so in the case of the gender wage gap, the expansion of ICT actually raises the relative demand for female workers. So the relative wage of female labor will increase. So in this sense, the expansion of ICT will reduce the gender wage gap. So if the government gives some subsidies to develop a new technology, then in the future, there will be decline in the gender wage gap.
So I think that's a follow-up question from Vincent.
Sorry for asking a question again.
That's all right, thanks.
Yeah, I was interested in the, I think in some sense you do control for culture, right? Because I assume that will enter the country fixed effects. So in a certain sense, the analysis is quite structural, it sort of, and how it changes over time. But we also know that gender is, if I can even use the word cultural, there are different sort of gender norms in different societies, even within the OECD, right?
Yeah.
Notwithstanding their high level of development. So there is I think the sort of disadvantage of sort of controlling for the countries is that we don't get to see the effect of the culture. So, but culture is very, I suppose, you talk about gender norms or the gender script is quite tightly linked to the country, sort of how it views gender and so on. And I assume that might affect gender relations, how men and women are paid in the labor market and so on. But because it is controlled for, you sort of don't see it. You have any comments on that?
Yeah, if there is a good measure of social norms and gender discrimination, we would be very happy to control for these factors. But we actually thought about controlling for these factors, but we didn't find a good available information on the social norms and racial discrimination over the sample periods.
Yeah.
We used the data from 1980s, and in the 2000s, we have some measures of gender discrimination, maybe social norms. We can construct maybe from the microdata as well. But throughout the sample period, we don't have such a measure, so we couldn't include.
If I can chip in a little bit here, I think one of the things is that many of the cultural differences as proxied by norms, they tend to be very different across countries, but they tend to be also quite stable over time. So I think Ken is focusing on like 1980 to 2000. And generally, if you look at the World Value Survey, I think by and large, actually, the differences tend to be quite stable even across a 20-30-year period, which I think then kind of gets wiped out by your country fixed effect. So the worry is that if there are like social norms that are changing over this period, that might be conflated with an ICT shock or like, you know, changes in the quantity component, right? I think you can show, like, even using World Value Survey for a subset of these countries, I believe that they're quite stable. I think we've shown them to be like at least rank order wise, like not changing a lot over these periods. So the countries that tend to be more egalitarian haven't really changed. the countries that tend to be, sort of much more conservative also tend to be like at the bottom. So the rank order, which I think helps your argument actually, because you're focused mostly on changes over time, as opposed to level differences. But there's something missing in that sense. That I see what you mean by like understanding like cross-country differences in like levels.
Because the model is sort of is fitted for time varying change. But I think there's something to be said about how mean differences in culture can also affect the outcomes.
That's probably a different paper, but it's a fascinating question. I think but that's a really interesting question.
What we have done in this paper is that we use instruments which may be orthogonal to changing social norm, and also we have control for country-specific nonlinear trends. So this can capture or factor bias technology change, change in the wage, and also change in social norms and discriminations. And the more, as we have shown the figures for each countries, the model predictions are fairly well with the actual data. So we are not very worried about the effects of social norms and gender discrimination on our parameter estimates. But at the same time, we do not mean to argue that these factors are not the important factor.
Yeah, because in fact, they could be coming in through the quantity measures, right? It's just that that's
true.
That's just like a reduced form, like whatever change could be due to anything. You're just counting, right? So
which causes the change to be very small, for example. Right, that could be.
Yeah, well, I think there is some empirical questions which may be interesting to address in the future.
So Hongwei has a follow-up question on the instrument, which is, do you have some concrete examples of some kinds of global shocks that that you're exploiting for the instrument?
Yeah. Great example. The concrete example. Well,
maybe not so much concrete examples, but maybe more like in thinking about the instrument, what is the kind of I mean, the global shock here should be something along the lines of.
So basically, we exploit variation in changes in input quantities across industries.
Right.
So we use capital and labor input quantities. So depending on the type of inputs, so these changes differently across industries over time. So,
right. So it'll be something like the manufacturing sector, like has a much larger change in so it's like the differences across industries, I guess.
Right.
At the global level.
So maybe decline in manufacturing sector occurs regardless of idiosyncratic changes in input quantities across countries. So in this case, that global shift is interacted with exposure to shock is a valid instrument, which is orthogonal to idiosyncratic change.
Great,
thank you for helping me to answer the question.
So, are there any other questions? Feel free to just unmute yourself and chime in. I guess we'll wait for a couple more minutes. I guess if there are no other questions, then I'll take this opportunity to thank Professor Yamada for taking the time to give this seminar and for a really interesting talk. I think it's left us with a lot to think about. And thank you again for sharing your research.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.